Okay, first we're going to go over the parts of the basal ganglia, which is very important for movement. So first you've got the cortex, which is sending information to the striatum, which is made up of the caudate and putamen. And then in between is the internal capsule, which are myelinated fibers that go from the cortex to the spinal cord. So it's part of the cortical spinal tract. And then next you've got the globus pallidus, and you have both the external segment and the internal segment. And then those end up talking to the ventral anterior ventral lateral thalamus, which we've got here in yellow. And then another important part is the subthalamic nucleus, which is right here and ends up talking to the globus pallidus a lot. And then finally, as a last sort of important part of basal ganglia involved in sending dopamine, got the substantia nigra right down here. Alright, so those are the parts of the basal ganglia. Now we're going to take a look at the components that we just looked at of the basal ganglia in this section of a sheep's brain. So you can see here the caudate kind of bulging out into the lateral ventricle, and then the putamen over here. You can kind of see like the stripe of the striatum right here with the internal capsule running through. And so down here would be the globus pallidus, which is hard to really see as differentiated in this slice. And then, of course, the cortex and things are here. So that's kind of what you can see in this slice of the brain. The basal ganglia has two pathways that it uses for movement. The direct pathway is important because that's the pathway that tells what muscles you need for the movement to move, and the indirect pathway is what tells other muscles that they're not necessarily and they shouldn't move. So first we're going to look at the direct pathway, and what's happening is the cortex is constantly talking to the striatum, and then the striatum is sending an inhibitory message to the internal segment of the globus pallidus. And since normally the internal segment is sending an inhibitory message to the thalamus, but because of this neuron's inhibitory message, it cancels out the brake that's on the thalamus, and so the thalamus is now able to send its excitatory messages back to the cortex, which then gets sent to the spinal cord and to the muscles. So that's the direct pathway. And in the indirect pathway, so you still have the cortex talking to the striatum, then you have the striatum sending an inhibitory message to the external segment of the globus pallidus, which is usually sending an inhibitory message to the subthalamic nucleus. So because you have that neuron being inhibitory on that one, it cancels out the brake on the subthalamic nucleus, which is now able to send an excitatory message over to the internal segment, which, as we know from before, is generally trying to send an inhibitory message, and now it's able to, so the brake is put back on the thalamus, so it can no longer tell the cortex to do anything. And it is in Huntington's disease the indirect pathway goes first because the neurons in the striatum die, and the neurons that are inhibitory in the striatum die, so they're not able to put this whole brake system on, and that's why you get the uncontrollable movement.